Okay, welcome back. We have sermons that, when I'm preparing them and when we hear them, they touch us deeply, and we have those that inform us. Today we're going to be on the information end, which in the end lends to us being touched later. And so last week we left off reading where John cited the Old Testament prophecies telling that the Messiah would not have a bone broken, and informing us that he would be pierced, and we covered that. Then after telling us that Jesus had given up the spirit, given up the ghost, as the King James puts it, that the Jews had sought to have the crucified taken down before sunset. And so they requested that their legs be broken. And then we talked about how that occurred. Jesus' legs were not. And then we pick it up at verse 38 through 42. And after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. There also came Nicodemus, which at first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now in that place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein never man was yet laid. There laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. So back to verse 38. It says, and after this, after they had broken the legs of the thieves, and they pierced Jesus' side, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave, gave him permission. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. Now all we know about Joseph of Arimathea is that he was a man of good character, good spiritual character. Mark 15:43 says he was, quote, an honorable counselor, that he waited for the kingdom of God. That was a quote. And, quote, he was a good man and a just man. And we know from Luke 23:51 that Joseph of Arimathea did not consent to the ways and purposes of the Sanhedrin, the ruling chief priests, though he appears to have been a part of them. And he appears to have feared them, probably wisely. In Christianity, there can be some real onus placed upon people who have means and who have wealth. Like anything in the faith, it's all about the heart of the individual and not the external lack or the external abundance of the person. In other words, just because a person is well off does not make them less of a Christian, and just because a person is poor does not make them more of one. We tend to think of it opposite. Naturally, there's a danger in abundance because of the fact that it takes the human heart away from God, and that's something that we know can happen very easily. But again, poverty can corrupt the human heart and make the person turn from God. So we see Joseph of Arimathea as a good example of that. Though wealthy, he didn't let his abundance corrupt him, but instead he continued to be a follower, a supporter of the Lord. I think what he did was really courageous, actually. The Sanhedrin, led by the high priest, they wrongly put Jesus to death. He couldn't do anything about that. But after they did it, he stepped in and took his body and gave him a proper burial. That is gutsy. I don't think they could have said anything to him, though, because he couldn't be questioned. It was an act of love. It was an act of benevolence towards somebody who didn't have a grave of his own. So while they may have said, that really irritates me, he did that. It undermines everything that we did to put him to death. I don't think they could have called him on it for doing it. Certainly the Sanhedrin knew he did it. And so while he apparently feared them and didn't follow Jesus openly, it says while Jesus was alive, he didn't let it stop him from treating the Lord justly and assuming responsibility for his corpse for the time. However, take note that we are not told that plans were made. Now, maybe they were, but we don't see Jesus saying, hey, who's going to take care of me when I die? It just seems like Joseph of Arimathea stepped in and said, I'm going to do this. We don't see that there is any preparation. And to me, this suggests that Jesus' own body would have been subject to being tossed in a common grave had Joseph not stepped in and done that. He was treated as a criminal. He died as a criminal. He didn't have money. He didn't have means. So it seems, could be wrong, but that he would have been thrown in a giant place due to the fact, especially that he wasn't wealthy. Isn't it interesting that even in his death, the care of his corpse was left to the goodness of others and to God in charge, working upon the hearts of others to act on his behalf? I always find that intriguing. One final note on Joseph of Arimathea. We really don't know where Arimathea is, for those of you who are geology students, or was, primarily because there are several cities of that name in Judea. Most people believe it's the same place known as Ramah, which is a short distance from Jerusalem. So that's Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy, owned a tomb, garden there near where Jesus was crucified, and came despite the fact that he did fear the Sanhedrin, of which he was most likely a part. Verse 39, and there also came another figure, Nicodemus, which at first came to Jesus by night. We remember studying him in John 3. And brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight, the King James says. So once again, we have another ruler of the Jews. He also must have feared, because he came to Jesus by night so as not to be discovered as following him or questioning him, came secretly to Jesus. And one who apparently believed on him, because he showed up too. Back in John 7:50, Nicodemus actually defended Jesus against the hatred of the Jewish council. So he too, like Joseph of Arimathea, had a heart and had ears for the truth that was given to him, and he knew there was something about that man. And Nicodemus, remember, when he came to Jesus by night and was taught of him, it was his conversation with Nicodemus that we learn about being born again. And that's Nicodemus who learned that and was taught the importance of being born again. I believe the teaching found or had a profound effect on Nicodemus. And so much so, in my estimation, that he possibly could have been born from above, as far as it was possible without the Holy Spirit descending. He possibly could have had a change somehow in him as he followed Jesus past death, and then proved his love for the King by participating in having him buried, by caring for the body of the Lord. And that showed he had great respect for Jesus, because the Jews put a lot of emphasis on burial. And for you to pay attention to someone's burial, that showed a lot of respect for that person and what you believe they represented. If you didn't think something of somebody very highly, if you thought he was a criminal or a deceiver, you would have been happy to see him tossed in a common communal grave. And so it shows the heart of Nicodemus. John tells us that Nicodemus brought with him a mixture of myrrh and aloes, and he says about 100-pound weight. Now, myrrh and aloes were used to preserve the bodies from what they say is putrefaction. And some people have questioned that amount of 100-pound weight of myrrh and aloes. It would have been enough to take care of the bodies of a couple hundred people. And so there's two thoughts on this. First, the word ekaton means 100, and critics have proposed that word is not used as ekatoron, and that means about a pound each. That makes more sense than 100 pounds, right? So there's debate as to whether we can take that literally or not. Now, a King James onlyist, someone who takes the King James as the inspired word of God that's infallible and has no error, would say it was 100 pounds. I believe you have the liberty to question that, because it would have been a lot of myrrh and aloe. However, Aristobulus wrote that 500 servants bearing aromatics came to the funeral of Herod. So we know that when Herod died, 500 people came, possibly bearing anywhere from up to a pound or something. And so that would be 500 pounds of the stuff. So we know, and we know that Gamaliel, that Josephus says that there was a truckload of spices bestowed upon him. So while we could be cynical and say there's no way that he brought 100 pounds with him, if Nicodemus had been born again, spiritually renewed, came to see the light and understood who Jesus was, it probably 1,000 pounds wouldn't have been enough when you think about it. And if he had access to it, he would have brought it, you know? So it could be either. It's not a debatable issue. It's just that there are two sides to it, and it depends on how you want to see it, how you're going to think it really reads. Verse 40, then they took, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, the body of Jesus, wound it in linen and with spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. They would wrap the body, and in the folds of the, if the cloth was this wide, they would take part of it and they would stick the aloe inside and they would fold it over, and then they'd wrap it around and they'd take another one and fold it over. So they'd wrap the body with this folded aromatic stuff around them. Apparently this was to keep the insects away and keep the body as fresh smelling as it could, because the tombs weren't always closed completely. We're going to talk about that tombs in a minute. Verse 41, now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. It wasn't uncommon for wealthy people to own their own gardens and have their own sepulchres and tombs carved out of the walls. This seems to be the case of Joseph of Arimathea. And again, since Jesus was numbered with the transgressors on the cross, it appears that the destiny of his body would have been the same as those as the criminals. But that's not true. We know that from prophecy. Having paid the debt, so he was numbered with the criminals on the cross. We know that he was with them in between them, but now having paid the sin debt, he didn't go to the place that they went. He went to another place by prophecy after he said, it is finished. So instead, and according to that prophecy, he was in the burial place of a rich man. He died amidst thieves, but he was buried with the rich. Very symbolic. It's in Isaiah 53:9, if you want the reference. It says, and he made his grave, speaking prophetically, with the wicked and with the rich in his death. So let me read that to you again. It says, and he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. So it could be speaking of, he made his grave, his spiritual death with the wicked, meaning he died for the wicked, and then with the rich, he was with the rich in his death. It's interpreted to suppose that he was buried with the rich, he died with the wicked. I believe it's part of the design to set his resurrection apart, to put him in this grave that has never been part of anybody else's tomb. In the graves, in the tombs, in the rocks, they would take these little crevices that would kind of be carved out and stuff bodies up in them. And if you had enough to hold 12 bodies, they would put the 12 bodies all on the shelves and stack them around inside. This was a place that no one else had ever been laid. And it was sealed by Pilate with a watch of guards over it, proof that his resurrection was real. And all of this is going to come together for us in a second. So, as stated, we really don't know much about Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, but what we do know is that when the Lord gave up his life, they stood up, they were willing to be counted, and they took care of his body. And we're going to talk about the grave itself in just a second. Last verse of chapter 19, there laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand, it was close by. We covered the Sabbath applications last week and a couple of weeks before that. So let's continue to read some into chapter 20, beginning at verse 1. Having said that, Let me have you turn to Matthew chapter 27 if you want, if you're following along. There's something that happens between the end of chapter 19 and the beginning of chapter 20 that Matthew covers in Matthew 27, verse 62. So if you're reading along, this is what it says. Now, the next day that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate. Okay? What this is saying is that as soon as it got dark, it was the next day to the Jews, and the chief priests went to Pilate. We read the next day, and we think in Western terms, it was the following morning they went to Pilate and said, hey, we want you to put a guard by it, and we want you to seal it up. That would not make sense. He would have been there for a full 12 hours or so before they even took action to have Pilate do it. So when it says the next day, we know that as soon as it got dark, it was the next day, and they went to Pilate. So it was the same night. Jesus had just been put in the grave, and before the sun went down, and the next day had begun, and then the chief priests went to Pilate. Verse 63 of Matthew 20 saying, and they said to Pilate, Sir, we remember that the deceiver said, they're talking about Jesus there, we remember the deceiver said while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Now, John doesn't cover any of this, but Matthew does. And he says they went and they said, this guy, this deceiver, he said he's going to rise again, right? We know Jesus taught this. We know he taught, I will rise again. Let me give you some examples. In Matthew 16:21, it says, from that time forth, Jesus began to show unto his disciples how he must go into Jerusalem, suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. It was taught. He taught that. Matthew 17:22 says, and while they abode in Galilee, Jesus said unto them, the Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and the third day he shall be raised again. And they were exceedingly sorry. Matthew 20:18 says, behold, we shall go, Jesus says, we shall go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed into the chief priests and into the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify him. And the third day he shall rise again. So in Matthew alone, we have 3 accounts where Jesus teaches openly, apparently, on the third day, I will rise again. The chief priests knew this. Okay, they had heard it. So the idea that he would rise again was remembered by his enemies, but it was something that was forgotten by Peter and John. And I cannot understand why, except for sorrow and mourning. We're going to get to that at the end, but Peter and John tells us they did not understand what it meant. The enemies of Christ did. His disciples did not. In any case, the leaders knew it, and they came to Pilate and said again, Sir, we remember that the deceiver said while he was alive, after 3 days I will rise again. One of the charges against Jesus was that he deceived the people. And it seems that they chose to refer him as the deceiver. And they use this title to just constantly knock him down. The deceiver, he's been put to death. We know he was a deceiver. He said he's going to rise again. And so they say to Pilate, command therefore, verse 64 of Matthew, that the sepulchre be made sure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away and say unto the people, he is risen from the dead. So the last error shall be worse than the first. This was what they recited to Pilate. In other words, command your men to come and stand guard and ensure that no funny games go on and his disciples come and steal his body and hide it or bury it somewhere and then run around and tell everybody he rose, right? And it seemed to say we only need it for 3 days. We need it until the first day of the week, Sunday morning, because he claimed he would rise within that time. They said, ensure this so that the last error shall not be worse than the first. In other words, do this, Pilate, to prevent another act of deception occurring, them stealing his body, making the last deception, the stealing of his body, worse than the first deception, him claiming he was the Messiah. So please come in. We don't want another deception to go on here. This deceiver could have trained his apostles to steal his body after he was dead to perpetuate the myth. I don't know why they would do that at the risk of the Roman retribution and everything else. Jesus has been killed, but this was what they feared. Verse 65 of Matthew, Pilate said unto them, you have a watch, go your way. He says to them, make it as sure as you can. Okay? So he says, you're going to have your watch, you have the guys assigned, go and make it, the grave, the tomb, as sure as you can. So in that day, the Jews had a guard, a watch of Roman soldiers who overlooked the temple at Antonia. It's a Tower of Antonia. It was on the northwest part of the temple. And there was a guard there from the Romans who were always there to make sure that peace was kept. All right? So Pilate either referred to these men as coming and taking on the watch over the tomb, or the ones who were assigned to the crucifixion. He moved them from there over to the tomb now. Either way, a watch was assigned. Because crucifixion sometimes lasted for days, they probably had allotted a band of men, 4 men, to be over that. And so Pilate probably thought, well, I've already had these men assigned to him. I can just move them over to the tomb and let him stay there another few days and watch the tomb. So Matthew says, so went they and made the sepulchre sure, the Jews, sealing the stone and setting the watch. So the chief priests go to the tomb and they make sure that the Roman soldiers are there. Some suggest that Pilate used his signet ring and sort of sealed the Roman watch of the stone on that. That has been taught, and I've read reports of that. We don't know, neither do we know, how the stone was sealed. But it was probably sealed in one of 3 ways. They probably took the stone and rolled it enough into the opening of the tomb so that it would seal it. They could have used cement to seal it, or they could have used clay to seal it. Some have suggested they used wax to seal it, appealing to the wax sealing of letters and signet rings over documents. That's very doubtful, and it's very doubtful that Pilate had anything to do with it at all. Now, we know from Daniel, going back in the Old Testament, that when he was put in a tomb, that he was cast into a cave, and it was sealed by the king's signet ring. And so they use that story and say, this is what happened too. It was a picture for Christ. But because Pilate says, you have your watch, go and make it as sure as you can, take care of it, it doesn't seem like he went and did this. I'm just trying to get to what the truth of it might be. So whatever it was, the tomb was sealed. And a guard was granted to watch it. We have to pause and look at the wisdom of God in this. Think about this, okay? Had all of this been done by his friends, then collusion could have been charged. Look at his friends took care of putting his body in there, but they also sealed it and they also put a guard over it because they were fearful and all that. Then everybody could have questioned his resurrection. But it was the enemies of Christ who took over and made sure that the security of the tomb was there, the guards were there, and that he was buried and sealed so that no chicanery could be concocted using the body. And with his enemies taking every possible precaution to secure Jesus in the tomb, every possible one, it seems like there could be only one reason how he got out. He resurrected. That's the thinking. Now, I know we could probably get around that with a lot of conjecture. Maybe the guards were bribed, all those different things that critics of Christianity will say, because it is so pivotal that he rose from the grave. If he didn't rise from the grave, nothing matters. It's done. All his claims, everything gone. No resurrection, no Christianity, at least in the way that Christians see it. You might go back and say he was a great man and he was a great leader and he did good things, but resurrection is what makes Christianity what it is. And so So let's go to chapter 20 and begin at verse 1, and we'll read through to 10 and get through there. There's not a lot, but there are some major things to cover. The first day of the week, Mary comes Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, to the sepulchre and sees the stone taken away from the sepulchre. Then she runs and comes to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, John the Beloved, whom Jesus loved, and said unto them, They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him. Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, and came to the sepulchre. They both ran together. The other disciple did outrun Peter, and came first to the sepulchre, and he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet he went not in. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and sees the linen clothes lie, and the napkin which was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Then went in also the other disciple, which came to the sepulchre first, and he saw and believed. And as yet they knew not the scripture, that he must rise again from the dead. Then the disciples went away again unto their own home. So this is John's report of what happened according to his words. And remember, he wrote a long time after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so his account was a little bit different, filling in gaps. So back to verse 1. The first day of the week comes Mary Magdalene early, when it was dark, unto the sepulchre, and sees the stone taken away from the sepulchre. That's John's account. Apparently abridged, omitting much of what the other Gospels include. For example, John merely says that Mary Magdalene came early, and while it was yet dark, and saw the stone taken away, and then takes off running, right? All right. So I want to go back to Matthew, and I want to show you what we're talking about here is one of the greatest criticisms of the Bible by people who do not believe in Christianity. It's the resurrection accounts. All right? So I just read to you in verse 1 of John 20 what he said. Mary came early, it was dark, the sepulchre, the stone was taken away, right? And then she goes and she runs off to get Peter and John. Here is Matthew's account of what happened. Matthew 28:1. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And behold, there was a great earthquake. For the angel of the Lord ascended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and became as dead men. The angel answered and said unto the women, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, for he was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen. As he said, Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he goeth before you into Galilee. There you shall see him. Lo, I have told you. And they departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy, and did run to bring the disciples word. And as they went to tell the disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, All hail. And they came and beheld his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, Be not afraid. Go tell my brethren that they go to Galilee, and they shall see me there. That is Matthew's account. John's is one word, one sentence, really. I mean, one verse. And so what happens is we bring in Mark and Luke, and we have incongruent accounts of the resurrection. The most pivotal and important part of the Christian faith. More important than the cross. Because if there's no resurrection, the cross is meaningless. Now, it's not more important because we don't put things in matters of importance here, but I'm just saying in argument's sake. So John has all of it happening to Mary Magdalene and includes very little of the details, the angels, the earthquakes, the others, the running, the this, the that. This is a big question, folks. What can we say in the face of it? All right. So, first of all, there are two ways that we can read things like this. We can look to the consistencies between the stories, and we could say that supports that there are elements of truth in them. Or we could look at the consistencies and we could be cynical and say there's collusion between them. okay? The second way is we could look at the inconsistencies and we can say, that means there's a problem with everybody's accounts. Or we could look at the inconsistencies and we could say, this validates the fact that it's authentic. And it really depends on the mindset that you have on how you read Scripture. If you're looking for things to find wrong, don't listen to someone who says they're not there. They are there. They're difficult. There are inconsistencies. But if you're looking to see them rightly, you will see them in that light and the Spirit will move you to see them. It really depends on what you come to the table with as you read. And people really don't believe that. They think, no, truth is truth. But I'm telling you, when we come to these accounts, it's very difficult to do it. And I won't do you any favors by preaching to you something that you walk out of here with and say, oh, I have certainty on that. You got to be honest. Because if we're not honest with each other, you'll never be strong in the faith. But in that honesty, there are answers. And they aren't what solve cynics' minds, but they solve me. So in other words, if the 4 accounts were perfect and exact, I would question the heck out of them. I mean, how would you take 4 people spread out who were writing at different times from different perspectives, some who were there and witnessing, some who were not, but taking it from others, going and writing what the Spirit was moving them to write? How could you expect a word-for-word account that was exact? That, to me, it's like there are churches that have witnesses that have witnessed certain things, and the witnesses all perfectly coincide with what they say happened. When that happens, I say that's collusion. That's making up a myth there, okay? We don't have that with this, and I think that's a beautiful thing. But if the 4 accounts contradict each other, there's always the charge that they're in error. So in either way, here's the thing, in either way, we as believers are in a corner. We can't please people if they were completely congruent, because people would say, oh, look they made this up. And we can't please them if there's inconsistencies, because we can say, look, they can't even agree with each other. And so for some reason, God has allowed this to come through the Word as we study it, and allow us to say, oh, you know what, to work through it and churn and understand what is actually happening here and decide if we're going to go along and research and study. So the only way I can see to approach these types of things, and there's a few of them through Scripture, is really reasonably. And let me explain. You probably haven't been involved in something, and Scott and Barbara, apologies for this example. And now that I'm about to give it, I'm thinking of you. But suppose that you have been involved in something terrible like a post office shooting, okay? And sorry, you guys. I know you work at one. But when something like that happens, chaos ensues. Absolute chaos. And there will be consistencies that come out of the story, and there's going to be inconsistencies. People who suppose that Kennedy and all those different things happen, they love the inconsistencies. They thrive off the inconsistencies. People who are looking for commonality and just to kind of understand what happened, look for the consistencies. So it's not that the inconsistencies make the event false. A madman did walk into the post office. A madman did shoot the postmaster behind the counter. Those are the facts of the story. We know that. But the events, as they're reported, they're going to take on different characteristics, because people who see them from different ways and different angles and different views, we're going to report them that way. Police officers know that if a crime goes on and everybody who's involved in the crime gives the same exact story using the same exact words, that there's a problem. Billy and I went to the house, we ate 4 Twinkies, and then we went out in the street and the bikes were there. We didn't take them. And then you interview Billy. We went in the house, we ate 4 Twinkies, we went outside. They say, okay, you guys, you're 2 different people. You would say this differently. You've concocted it, right? So when it comes to the resurrection, remember, Jesus is gone from the tomb. And when that happens, people start running. And people who are there involved are going different directions, and some people are doing this and some people are doing that, and various accounts pop up. And so we know that the reporting is, we're going to have various accounts. Secondly, we know that the given accounts were never meant to be exhaustive. Matthew did not write exhaustively, neither did Matthew, Luke, John, or Mark. It's just like the Genesis account. There's like 27 words that describe how God made the world. It's not exhaustive. We don't read it for the exhaustiveness of it. We read it to see what the framework is. So we have framework stories here, okay? So we know they weren't exhaustive. Finally, we can take all the account information from all the reports that we have, and we can present a chronology. And I'm going to give that to you right now. And this chronology makes sense. And it doesn't answer everything, but it gives us an ability to take everything that happened in those 4 accounts and give us a narrative that makes sense regarding the resurrection. So, for example, if a man came into the post office and shot the postmaster and the postmaster died, those would be the essentials of such a horrible, terrible story. Whether he took large strides to get to the counter, whether the shooter was robotic or fluid, whether it was witnessed by 2 people who say it was 3:30 in the afternoon and 4 people who said it was 3:55, all of that stuff is going to play into the inconsistencies, but the consistency is a man came in, he shot the postmaster in there. So let's take a chronological look of the events we can say existed in the resurrection story. 1, Jesus was buried, and several women watched. We know this. Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, John 19. The tomb was sealed, a guard was set. At least 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, prepared spices to go to the tomb. That's Mark 28, Mark 16. The angel did descend from heaven, rolls the stone away, and sits on it. There is an earthquake. Guards do faint. All of that part of this, what order? We know this. The women arrive at the tomb and they find it empty. They. John just uses Mary Magdalene to represent the core, but it's a they. Mary Magdalene alone leaves the other women and runs to tell the disciples. That's what we're reading right now in John. The women are still at the tomb and they see the angels and they tell them that Jesus is risen, and he instructs them to go and tell the disciples. So the women now have taken off. Magdalene has taken off ahead of them. The women leave to bring the news to the disciples, Matthew 28:8. The guards now are getting up. This is part of the story. They rouse themselves. They report the empty tomb to the authorities, who bribe the guards to say that the body was stolen. That's in Matthew 11 through 15. So that's not included in this narrative at all. But the guards wake up, they run for their lives, they go to the chief priest, and the chief priests say, here, let's pay you some money, just witness that the body was stolen. Mary, the mother of James, and the other women on their way to find the disciples see Jesus. That's not in John's account. The women relate to what they have seen and heard to the disciples. Peter and John run to the tomb, see that it's empty, find the grave clothes. That's in Luke and in John, which we just read. And Mary returns to the tomb. She sees angels, and then she sees the Lord. All of those are taken from the 4 accounts. They give us a chronology. There's things in there that are not absolutely consistent, but it gives us the essentials of the story. So, are there inconsistencies or incongruities to the accounts? There is. And if someone tries to formulate a way to make it entirely consistent, they're just creating a fiction so that we can feel better, because you can't do it. But I'm glad there are. I believe it leads to authenticity, which I appreciate. Okay. And you know, you know this, but we have people who watch, and people watch these later. I think this stance is really important for us to take in this day and age, because we're going to have kids and grandkids, and this stuff is getting pretty tough in the battle. We have the computers now that can do word searches and sentence phrases, computers that can put this stuff together and show inconsistencies, and we're going to have our grandkids saying, well, Grandpa, tell me the story of this. And you go and tell it the old-fashioned way where there's absolutely no question as to what the narrative says. And the kid says, yeah, but I learned, and they confront you, and automatically we lose ground with the most wonderful thing. And so let's not do that. All right? So back to John chapter 20. Speaking of Mary Magdalene, it says, then she runs and comes to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loves, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him. Now, John is writing this. John heard this. This is a first-person account. So I believe this absolutely happened, and John is reporting exactly. Mary came to them and said to him and Peter this exact thing. Interestingly enough, the Jews thought that the Lord's disciples were going to take Jesus' body, and here we see Mary Magdalene saying that the Jews have taken away his body. So everybody's blaming everybody else for having taken him away. Verse 3, Peter therefore went forth and that other disciple, John the Beloved, and came to the sepulchre, and they ran both together, and the other disciple did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre. I know I said that this was included partly from brotherly competition, that John was getting the edge in on Peter, that they left together, but the one, John outran Peter. But it could be John's way of simply explaining, listen, this is why I got to the tomb first. I outran him, and I got there, and I'm the one who stooped down and looked inside. Verse 5, and he stooped down, John the Beloved, and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet went he not in. Now, when I was engaged with that other religion of my past, I used to see these artistic renditions of Jesus exiting the tomb. And they would have like a 7-foot to 10-foot archway that was like perfectly carved. It looked like one of those granite cutters cut it, you know? It's perfectly carved, and he comes out, and there's a stone that's like the size of this set here, this thick, perfect circle, rolled to the side, or it was split perfectly in two, and he stands there like Superman, you know? And I used to look at it and I thought, how did that stone ever get moved? It had to have been 4,000 pounds. And my teacher would say, God moved it with his finger, and all this stuff, okay? So, but it seems that the historical reality of the whole things is that tombs had very small holes to get into. And you had to stoop down. So the narrative tells us John stooped down to look inside. He didn't walk up like the pictures I used to see. He had to stoop down, and then once you got inside the cave, it was hollowed out with a lot of room, depending on the size of the tomb. So a man would have to get crouched down. They'd have to probably drag the body in, and maybe once they got in, there was enough room to stand. We have some support for this when John says, I stooped down. And this helps bring some reason to the stone that was rolled away. It's not that God couldn't roll away a stone, but they were securing the tomb. So they had to move the stone. They had to set it in place. Men did that. And they rolled a stone that was movable by man. And when you get to a stone of a certain size, you're not moving that thing. And they're not very big. So we know that the opening had to have been relatively small, and the stone had to be relatively small to push in there and then seal with concrete clay, or just push it in tightly. After John stoops down and looks in, he writes, then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went in to the sepulchre, and sees the linen clothes lie, and the napkin, which was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in the place by itself. Peter is so predictable. John is outside, stooping down, looking, and Peter scurries right on in. I love the guy. I love it. Now, there's floating around a rumor, I think it was propagated by the Calvary chapels, and probably with good intent, that this napkin that was taken and folded is symbolic, very symbolic in Jewish culture, that I'm coming back. And what the story has said is that, listen, the Jews, when they sit down to eat in ancient Israel, they would eat their food, and then they'd take their napkin and they would dabble it their face and they'd fold it. And that would mean I'm not done eating, or I'm going to come back for the party. This is my place. And they would fold it nicely. And so it says when Peter and John went into the tomb and they saw the napkin folded in a place separate from the grave clothes, that this was a picture. It's a beautiful picture of this event. And I hate to burst bubbles, it's not. It's just another story. It's a story that we've created to, I don't know why, but first of all, we know from the Greek that the napkin could be a towel. It was what covered his head. And it does not mean a napkin, because here in America, when we say, do you have a napkin? We know we're talking probably about something to wipe our mouth with. This is not at all the same thing. The Greek word does not mean that. Secondly, the term for folded in the Greek could mean crunched up. It could mean twisted. It could mean folded. It could mean any of those things. So to suggest that the napkin was taken like a napkin you eat with and folded to signify I'm coming back is conjecture. The third thing is there is no historical evidence anywhere that the Jews ever folded their napkin and it symbolized that they're coming back. Nowhere. But the fourth thing is the coup de grace in it, and that is Jews didn't use napkins. Jews washed. They washed everything constantly. And so when they take the Greek word that the King James translates to napkin and say that it was what covered Jesus' head and that he got off and he folded it to symbolize I'm coming back like you would at a Jewish dinner, it's not true. It's not anywhere true. And so problematic all the way. We have a wonderful faith. It's substantiated by archaeology and genetics and history and linguistic proof. We have a wonderful faith that's supported by ancient manuscript evidence that blows the minds of any Greek scholar, because there's nothing that compares with the Greek supported evidence that we have for this or the Hebrew. We have a faith we don't need to create fictional stories and myths to support, to make ourselves feel better and to pass around, to give your church something new to glom on and talk about as you exit, some new discovery. We don't need to concoct fictions. This faith stands alone. In fact, you got to be kind of aware and wary of those types of things. So the whole point in John mentioning the headcloth and the covering was simply to describe the scene. I came in, and what was covering his head was separate from the linen clothes. That's what I saw. Okay? We don't need to have any symbolism to that. It's okay. And then after Peter went into the sepulchre, John followed, verse 8. Then went in also that other disciple, it says, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed. So it was like, I looked, John is saying, first-hand witness. I saw and believed. What did he believe? That Jesus rose from the dead as a first-hand witness. He rose. And he gives his personal witness through this. This is the stuff we're looking for. This is the stuff that says that resurrection occurred. This is something a first-hand witness just wrote to us what happened, and this is what he saw. And if that resurrection occurred, let me tell you something, everything else is a thumbs up. Absolutely sell yourself out for this faith, okay? Because it did occur, and that witness is there. And we have John's other writings that support such things and other witnesses. Verse 9, which puzzles me to no end. I'm sorry, this has been a puzzling thing, but for as yet they knew not the scripture that he must rise again from the dead, John adds. It says, here he believed. Now, there's a number of ways we could take that. We could look at knew not in the gnosko, meaning we didn't know he would. He could be saying we were taught he was. We didn't know he would. We could say that they were so overwrought with emotion that they didn't remember that he had said, I'm going to rise from the dead. And but it's quizzical that the chief priest remembered and set the watch and sealed the tomb, but these guys didn't. There's a reason for it. I believe what he says. I just don't know what that reason is, because they were certainly taught it. Verse 10, then the disciples went away again into their own home. Verse 9, troubling. We might touch on it again and give more reasons if you have questions on it. But Peter and John went back to their house, and that ends John's narrative of what happened in these first parts of Jesus' resurrection.